The church was full. Every pew was packed with people I had known my whole life. Neighbors, cousins, old school friends, people who had watched me grow up. White roses lined the ends of each row. Soft piano music drifted through the warm air. My dress was heavy against my legs, the long train pooling behind me on the marble floor. My hands gripped my bouquet so tight my knuckles had gone pale. I had dreamed about this moment since I was a little girl, and now it was finally here. I turned to my father, waiting for him to take my arm. He was standing 3 feet away from me in his gray suit, his hands at his sides. He looked at me, and then he slowly shook his head. Not a small shake. Clear, deliberate one. His jaw was tight and his eyes were cold. Then he said it, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear every word. "I'm not walking her. She made her choice." The gasp started immediately. I felt every single one of them like a needle against my skin. My bouquet slipped slightly in my grip. I looked down the aisle to where Daniel stood waiting at the altar. He was watching, and he said absolutely nothing. Before we continue with our story, please like and comment the time you're watching this story, and also hit the subscribe button if you like stories like this. For a moment I could not move. My feet felt like they were fixed to the floor. The music kept playing, soft and out of place, like a soundtrack to the wrong moment entirely. People in the front rows were turning in their seats, whispering to each other behind their hands. I could feel the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on me. My stepmother, Vivian, stood slightly behind my father. She did not look shocked. She was watching me with this quiet little smile on her face. Her lips pressed together like she was trying to hide how satisfied she was. That was when I understood this was not a sudden outburst. This was not my father having a bad moment or letting his emotions get the better of him. Vivian had been part of this. The way she was standing, the way she was watching, it was too calm, too prepared. My wedding coordinator, a kind woman named Petra, appeared at my elbow and leaned close. "We need to start," she whispered, her voice apologetic but firm. I looked at her. I looked at my father. And then, very slowly, I turned back toward that long aisle with the roses and the candlelight and all those watching faces. I had not yet fallen apart. But Vemi father had been angry with me for months. It started in January, about 6 months before the wedding. He had called me one evening and told me he had a list of people who needed to be invited. Not requests, not suggestions. List. 14 names, most of whom I barely knew. They were business contacts, men he played golf with, partners from deals he was trying to close. He wanted them at my wedding because he said it would be a relaxed setting where he could build certain relationships. I told him no. I told him as kindly as I could. Daniel and I had set a firm guest limit because the venue we had chosen, a restored chapel on the edge of town, only held 120 people. We had already filled every spot with people who actually mattered to us. My father went silent on the phone for a long time. Then he said, "You will regret this." I thought he meant he would sulk for a few weeks and eventually come around. I had seen him get upset before and always return to normal. So I did not apologize. I held my position. I believed he would calm down and show up on my wedding day like a father was supposed to. I was wrong. Very wrong. I looked down the aisle at Daniel. He was standing at the altar in his navy suit, hands folded in front of him. He had seen everything. He had heard my father's words just like everyone else in that church. And yet there he was, still composed, not moving even one step toward me. His expression was strange. Not worried, not ready to fix anything. He looked almost like a man who was waiting to see what would happen next, like he was watching something from a safe distance. A feeling moved through me that I could not quite name. It was not anger. It was closer to confusion, a cold and quiet confusion. Daniel and I had been together for 3 years. In all that time, whenever I had faced something difficult, he had always stepped in. He was the kind of person who hated conflict but hated unfairness more. At least that was what I had always believed. So why was he standing there doing nothing? Why was he not walking toward me? Why was he not saying anything to stop this? The piano had finally gone quiet. The entire church had gone quiet. My father still had not moved. Vivian was still smiling. And Daniel was still watching. The silence was loud in a way I had never felt before. Vivian stepped forward. She did not rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they know they have the room. She placed one hand on my father's arm and turned to look at the guests with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and dramatic at the same time. "Perhaps," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we should consider postponing. This is clearly not the right moment. We don't want anyone to regret a decision made in such a difficult atmosphere." She paused for effect. "It would be better for everyone." Some people in the pews were nodding. Actual nodding. People who had known me since childhood, people who had eaten at our dinner table, people who had come today to celebrate me. And they were nodding at the woman who had only entered my life when I was 15 years old and had made every year since then a little harder than it needed to be. I felt something hollow open up in my chest. My father said nothing to contradict her. He just stood there, backing her up with his silence. In that moment, I understood something clearly. This was not just about the guest list. This was about power. Had always been about power. And they had chosen my wedding day as the place to prove who had it. Then I heard it. A single chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound cut straight through the silence, sharp and sudden, and every head turned toward the third row. A man stood up slowly. He was tall, slightly heavy around the shoulders, with gray at his temples and deep lines in his face that told you he had lived through difficult things. He was wearing a simple dark suit that did not fit quite as well as he probably hoped, and his tie was slightly crooked. I had not seen this man since I was 12 years old. His name was Uncle Bryn, my father's older brother. The man my father had not spoken a single word to in 15 years. He stood in that pew with his hands loose at his sides and his chin level, and he looked at me with eyes that were steady and serious and kind. Then he said it plainly, without drama, without hesitation. "If no one else will, I will." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I was not even breathing. I watched my father's face change. The color left it slowly, the way light leaves a room when you pull the curtains closed. His jaw went tight. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curled slightly. He had not expected this. For the first time all morning, he looked truly afraid. My father turned toward his brother, and the expression on his face was no longer cold. It was something sharper than that. His voice came out low and controlled, but with something shaking just underneath it. "You don't get to play hero," he said. "Not after what you did." Uncle Bryn did not flinch. He kept looking at him with that same steady expression, like a man who had already decided how he would handle this moment. But I was frozen. "What you did." My father had just said those words in front of 100 people and I had no idea what they meant. I had grown up knowing only that Bryn and my father had a falling out when I was young. No one ever explained it properly. When I asked as a teenager, my father changed the subject. My mother, before she passed, would only say it was a family matter. Vivian refused to discuss it entirely. So all my life, Uncle Bryn had been a ghost. A man I barely remembered. And now he was standing in my wedding church while my father looked at him with something that went far deeper than anger. It looked like fear mixed with old guilt. Like a secret that had never been properly buried. My hands were shaking. I could feel it in my fingers, in the stems of the bouquet, in the way my breath kept catching before it could settle. I looked at Uncle Bryn standing in that pew. I looked at my father, who had gone very still. I looked back down the aisle at Daniel, who still had not moved. And then I made a choice. I took one step toward my uncle. Just one. But it was enough. The whole room shifted slightly, like something had changed in the air. Uncle Bryn stepped out of the pew and walked toward me slowly. His hands out, palms open, giving me time to change my mind if I needed to. I did not change my mind. My father's voice came loud and hard behind me, sharp enough to make several people in the front row physically flinch. "If you do this," he said, "don't you ever call me your father again." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Felt them. I felt every single one. But I did not stop walking. I reached out and took my uncle's arm, and his hand covered mine and he held it steady, and for the first time that entire morning, I felt like I was not going to fall. We began to walk. The piano player, to her credit, started playing again after a few seconds of silence, quietly and carefully, like she was not sure if she should but had decided that the moment needed it. Uncle Bryn walked slowly, matching my pace, not rushing me or pulling me forward. His arm was solid. He smelled like cedar and something old-fashioned, like a library or a chest that had not been opened in years. My father did not follow us. He stood at the back of the church, and I could feel him watching, but I did not turn around. The guests were watching too. Some were quietly crying. Others were whispering. A woman near the middle row reached out and touched my arm gently as I passed. A small gesture, and it nearly broke me completely. Halfway down the aisle, I allowed myself one glance at the altar. Daniel was still standing there in his navy suit. He had not stepped forward. He had not come to meet me. He was watching me approach with Uncle Bryn, and his expression had shifted. It was no longer neutral. His jaw was tight and his eyes were moving between me and my uncle with something that looked almost like irritation. Not concern. Not relief. Irritation. That detail planted itself in my mind and stayed there. We reached the altar. Uncle Bryn placed my hand gently into the crook of his arm as we stopped, and then he turned to look at Daniel in a way that was quiet but not particularly friendly. Daniel looked at him briefly, then looked away. The officiant, a gentle older man named Reverend Okeke, was standing at the front with his hands folded. His expression carefully composed, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. This was not the ceremony he had prepared for. Daniel leaned slightly toward me. "Are you okay?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled. "We can still do this." It was the right thing to say. The problem was how he said it. There was no warmth in it. No relief. It sounded like someone trying to get a meeting back on schedule. Like the morning had been an inconvenience that needed to be resolved so we could proceed. I looked at him. I really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you are suddenly trying to see past all the things you already decided about them. And what I saw made me uneasy. He was tense. His eyes kept moving. And there was something behind them that I had never noticed before, or maybe had never let myself notice. I had just taken my place at the altar when I noticed it. Vivian was still seated in the front row with her phone out beneath the edge of her handbag, her fingers moving across the screen quickly and quietly. It was a small thing. Except that in the very next moment, Daniel shifted beside me and I heard the soft vibration of his phone in his jacket pocket. He did not take it out. But his jaw tightened. His eyes moved forward and lost focus for a second, like a person processing information received through a different channel. Kept my face still. I kept looking toward the Reverend, toward the candles and the tall arched window behind the altar. But something was unlocking inside my mind, slowly and with terrible clarity. Vivian had texted. Daniel's phone had buzzed. They were in communication. Right now, during my wedding ceremony. My stepmother and my soon-to-be husband were speaking to each other in real time. I did not yet know what the message said. But I knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally stopped looking away, that something was very wrong. And I knew that whatever it was, it had been planned long before this morning. Reverend Okeke opened his book. He cleared his throat softly and looked between Daniel and me with an encouraging expression, clearly hoping we could proceed without further interruption. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice steady and full. He had barely finished the sentence when my father spoke from the back of the church. Not loudly. He did not need to be loud. The church was so still that his voice carried perfectly. "Before this continues," he said, "I think people deserve to know the truth about her." The room went rigid. Reverend Okeke stopped speaking. Uncle Bryn, who was seated in the front row now, turned his head slowly toward the back of the church. Daniel stood completely still beside me. I turned around. My father was walking up the center aisle with the slow and deliberate pace of a man who believed he was in control of the room. His face had recovered its coldness. Vivian was right behind him, her handbag tucked under one arm. Her expression arranged into something that looked like reluctant concern but was actually the opposite. My father reached the front of the church and stopped. He looked out at the guests, then he looked at me and he began to speak. "My daughter," my father said, drawing out the word in a way that made it sound like a criticism, "has spent the last several years presenting herself as someone who is independent and responsible. Someone who built her own life." He paused. "But the truth is very different." Whispers moved through the church like a current. People shifted in their pews. I stood at the altar with my hands at my sides and I made myself breathe. He continued. He said that I had spent years taking from the family and giving nothing back. That I had leaned on his name and his connections to open doors for myself, and then, once I was through those doors, I had cut ties with everyone who helped me get there. He said I was selfish and ungrateful, and that my refusal to include his business partners at the wedding was just the latest example in a long pattern of using people and discarding them. He said that Daniel deserved to know what kind of person he was marrying. The guests were very quiet. Some were looking at me with uncertain expressions, trying to figure out what to believe. Vivian nodded along to every word. I stood there and I did not cry and I did not argue. I waited. Because I was not the only one in that church who knew the truth. The silence after my father finished was thick and heavy. He looked satisfied. He turned slightly toward Vivian, and she gave him a small confirming nod. He had said what he came to say. He believed it had landed. Then Uncle Bryn stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform it. He simply stood up from his front row seat, turned to face my father, and said one sentence in a calm, clear tone that reached every corner of that church. "That's interesting," he said, "considering she's the one who paid off your debts." The reaction was immediate. People turned to each other. Someone near the back said something under their breath. The satisfied look on my father's face collapsed. It fell apart from the inside the way a wall collapses, not all at once but in stages, one piece and then another. His eyes moved to me quickly, almost involuntarily, like a reflex, like he was checking to see how much I had told. And I held his gaze. I did not look away. Because I had nothing to hide. I never did. It was always him. Uncle Bryn remained standing. He spoke slowly, giving each word room to settle. He explained what had happened 4 years ago, when my father's construction business had come dangerously close to collapsing. 2 large loans had come due at the same time. His main contractor had walked off a project mid-build, leaving a legal mess and a financial hole that threatened to pull everything down with it, including the house I had grown up in. My father had come to me privately. He had told me not to tell anyone, not Daniel, not any of our relatives, not a single person. He had framed it as a temporary situation, something he would repay, something that needed to stay quiet to protect the family's reputation. I had taken money from my savings account and from an investment I had been building for 5 years. A total of £42,000. I had transferred it quietly. Had told no one. My father had promised he would repay it. He never did. Uncle Bryn knew because I had called him, uncertain and afraid, needing someone I could trust to tell me if I was doing the right thing. He had advised me carefully. And he had remembered everything. My father's face had gone a color I had never seen on him before. For a moment nobody moved. The church was so quiet I could hear the candles. Then I turned to look at Daniel. His expression had changed completely. He was staring at Uncle Bryn with wide eyes, and there was something there that did not make sense to me. He looked shocked. Genuinely, visibly shocked. Not at my father. Not at Vivian. He was shocked at the £42,000. And that was the detail that broke something open inside me. Because if Daniel was hearing this for the first time in a church full of wedding guests, it meant he had not known about the money. But if he had not known about the money, why had he been communicating with Vivian during the ceremony? What exactly had he been part of? Daniel turned to me slowly. His mouth opened and then closed again. He looked like a man trying to find the right version of events to land on. I watched him do it. I watched him choose his next expression carefully, watched him adjust, and something inside me went very still and very cold. I asked him one question, quietly, just for him. What did you know? He did not answer right away. He looked at me and then looked away and then looked back. His mouth moved slightly, shaping words that did not come out. That pause was short. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in those seconds I understood everything. When someone truly has nothing to hide, they answer immediately. When someone loves you and you have just asked them a direct question, they do not hesitate. Daniel hesitated. And in that hesitation was the shape of everything he had not told me. My chest felt tight. I thought about the last 3 months. The moments he had been quieter than usual. The phone calls he took in another room. The evening 3 weeks ago when I had walked into the kitchen and he was sitting at the table with a document in front of him, and when I asked what it was, he said it was nothing important and folded it quickly. I had let it go. I had told myself it was work, that I was being anxious, that everything was fine. I had been so focused on the wedding, on the flowers and the seating chart and the dress, that I had stopped paying attention to the things that mattered. Daniel finally spoke. It's not what you think, he said. Which is exactly what people say when it is precisely what you think. The memory came back to me sharp and sudden, like stepping on something in the dark. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel had slid a document across the kitchen table. He had called it a formality, a financial planning document that his family solicitor recommended all couples complete before marriage. He said it was standard practice. He said it protected both of us. I had been distracted that evening, running late for a call with my cousin about bridesmaid arrangements, and I had only glanced at it before he took it back and said we would go over it together properly later. We never did. He never brought it up again. I had forgotten about it entirely. Until now, standing at this altar, I was remembering the weight of that document in my hands and the way he had pulled it back before I could read it through. I was remembering that his mother had called him 3 times that same evening. I was remembering that Vivian had visited our flat 2 weeks before the wedding, unannounced, and Daniel had let her in and they had sat in the front room together for 40 minutes while I was working upstairs. He had told me later she just wanted to drop off a card. I had believed him. I was very good at believing things I should have questioned. Daniel took a breath and began talking fast. He said it was a prenuptial agreement. He said his family had pushed for it. He said it was not his idea. He said he had meant to discuss it with me but kept losing the nerve because he knew how I would react. He said none of it was sinister. It was just about protecting assets in the event things did not work out. Which is a very strange thing to say at your own wedding. As he spoke, I began to understand the full picture. My father had known about my savings. He had known because I had transferred money to his account 4 years ago and he knew exactly what I had. He had told Daniel's family. Or perhaps Vivian had. And Daniel's family, seeing a woman with considerable savings and no prenuptial agreement in place, had decided those assets needed to be protected by them. The prenup would have handed Daniel significant control over any shared finances. My father would benefit indirectly, because a man with control over my finances would be far easier to pressure for money than a woman who held everything herself. It was not complicated. Greed rarely is. They had simply planned to use my wedding day to rush me into signing before I had time to think. Vivian stepped forward from the front row. She had been standing slightly to the side, watching it all unfold, and up until now she had managed to hold on to that practiced expression of reluctant concern. But something had been building in her, and now it came out. She looked at me directly and her voice was sharp and impatient and stripped of every performance. You were supposed to agree before today, she said. The words landed like a dropped glass. Complete silence. Then the sound of the room processing what had just been said. She realized it immediately. I watched the mistake cross her face, the flicker of her eyes, the way her chin lifted slightly like she was trying to take the words back up into herself. But they were out. They were in the air. They were inside the ears of every single person in that church. A woman near the middle of the room said softly, "Did she just say what I think she said?" Someone else near the back answered quietly, "Yes." Uncle Bryn was looking at Vivian with an expression of calm and unsurprised recognition, like a man watching something he had predicted arrive exactly on schedule. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and clear and strangely free. The room changed. I could feel it shift like a tide. The whispers were no longer about me. They were moving between guests in tight, urgent clusters, heads turning toward my father and Vivian, toward Daniel, away from me. An older woman too rose back. A friend of my late mother's who had known our family for decades, stood up from her pew and said quietly but clearly, "This is disgraceful." No one argued with her. My father opened his mouth. He looked at the guests and then at Vivian and then at me, and I watched him try to find the version of this moment in which he still had authority. It was not there anymore. The document he had waved like a flag. His evidence against me, his grand accusation, had been answered by £42,000 of silent, unpublicized loyalty. His weapon had turned around. Vivian was frozen in place, still holding her handbag, her expression for the first time in years showing something genuine. It was not guilt. I did not think Vivian was capable of guilt exactly. It was the particular discomfort of a person who has just realized that the room is no longer with them and cannot be recovered. My father was still trying. But the room had already made up its mind. I turned to Daniel. He was watching his hands. He could not look at me, and that told me everything I needed to know about how clearly he understood what he had done. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech. I simply looked at him and said the truest thing I could find. "You knew," I said. "You sat across from me every night for weeks and you knew, and you stayed silent." He looked up. His eyes were wet, which surprised me slightly. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. "They said it was a simple formality. I thought you'd sign and it would be fine. You thought I'd sign something you hid from me." He did not answer. There was nothing to answer. I reached down and took off my engagement ring. It was a beautiful ring. He had picked it out himself on a Tuesday afternoon and surprised me with it in the middle of an ordinary dinner, and that had been one of the best moments of my life. I held it for 1 second, letting myself feel the weight of that memory. Then I set it down on the altar ledge carefully. The sound it made against the stone was very small. The gasp from the room was not. Daniel reached forward instinctively, like he was going to take the ring and put it back in my hand. "Wait," he said. "Just wait. We can talk about this." I looked at him and felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger but somewhere between the two. A quiet grief for the version of this relationship I had believed in. "There's nothing to fix," I said. "You had every opportunity to tell me the truth, and you chose not to." My father tried to recover. He stepped forward and began explaining to the guests in his authoritative business voice, saying this was a misunderstanding. Emotions had run high, the situation had been blown out of proportion. He said everyone needed to calm down. Few people nodded vaguely, but most were not listening anymore. The older guests looked away. The younger ones had their phones out. Whatever version of events my father tried to construct now, there were 100 witnesses to what had actually been said. Not one of them was going to forget Vivian's words. Not one of them was going to forget Uncle Bryn standing up when no one else would. My father was still talking, but the room was no longer his. Uncle Bryn placed his hand gently on my shoulder. He did not say a word. I turned away from the altar. I turned away from Daniel and my father and Vivian and all the careful plans they had laid out for this day. I walked up the center aisle of that church by myself, and as I walked, the guests went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Before, the silence had felt like judgment. Now it felt like witnessing, like people making room for something real. A few people reached out as I passed, small touches on my arm, my hand, my shoulder. I heard someone whisper, "You did the right thing," and I pressed my lips together and kept moving. I pushed open the heavy church door and stepped out into the morning. The sun was bright and the air smelled like cut grass and the first warmth of early summer. I stood on the steps and breathed. For the first time in months, maybe longer than that, I was not managing anything. I was not adjusting myself to fit someone else's expectations or staying quiet to keep the peace or setting aside what I actually needed so that everyone around me could be comfortable. I was not performing anything. I was just standing in the sun and breathing. And it felt more than anything else like freedom. In the weeks that followed, things unraveled for all of them in the quiet, steady way that truth always unravels lies. My father's financial situation, which he had worked hard to keep hidden, became known among his business circle. The people he had wanted at my wedding heard the full story from various guests, because 100 people keep nothing secret. 2 partnerships fell through. The reputation he had built on the appearance of control cracked under the weight of the real story. Vivian's slip in that church cost him more than he ever anticipated. Daniel's family withdrew quietly. No dramatic ending, just a slow distancing, the way people retreat when a scheme has failed. Daniel called me twice. I did not answer. There was nothing left to say. Uncle Bryn and I had dinner together the following Sunday. It was the first real conversation we had shared in 15 years. He told me the story of what had happened between him and my father, different from what I had always imagined, and it made me grieve the time we had lost. But it also helped me understand why he had stood up when no one else would. Some people carry the truth for years, waiting for the right moment to set it down. I rebuilt slowly, kept my savings, kept my dignity, and I kept Uncle Bryn, not the family I started with but the family I finally chose.